On a rugged day, the waves are just crashing there in this spot, and they can have explosion of the waves like 40 to 60 feet high. It's absolutely magical.
Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks, and my mission is to bring you epic but doable adventures from around the world. Today we're heading to the extraordinarily rugged Acadia National Park. Acadia is located in northeast Maine, just southwest of Bar Harbor. It's been preserved since the early 1900s, and is the only national park in the northeastern United States. At Acadia, you see mountains, a really rugged coastline, both pine and deciduous woodlands, lakes, ponds, and wetlands. There's plenty to explore. There's almost 50,000 acres, or about 200 square kilometers. We'll visit Cadillac Mountain, the tallest mountain on the eastern coast, Thunderhole, where the waves crash, just like our guests explained in the intro. And there's a multitude of islands to explore, especially Mount Desert Island. You'll find over 37 types of mammals, including black bears, moose, and deer, and over 300 species of birds, including raptors, songbirds, and waterfowl. There's plenty of hiking for all skill levels, biking, kayaking and canoeing, horseback riding, and guided boat tours. So let's get started on our adventure in Acadia National Park. Could you start by introducing yourself and perhaps telling us your age?
Hi, I am Keita Roberts, and I am 32 years old.
Oh, great. Now, we met out at a conference, and I found out that you were a very adventurous traveler yourself. You're into mountain biking and running and camping, and I was like, kindred spirit. And so when I found out that you were very familiar with Acadia, I asked you to come on the program and tell us a little bit about what you saw. But before we begin, can you tell us how you first got into adventure traveling?
So my first childhood memory, and I have a fondness for the national park, so I'm very happy that you asked me to speak about Acadia. My first memory of national parks is actually the only childhood vacation I took with my mother. She died while I was very young. She took us to Shenandoah National Park, and we grew up and things like that. And once I finally had the ability to go out on my own and venture and things like that, I picked up and I went to Shenandoah, and I went to Shenandoah over and over and over again. And I kind of know that park like the back of my hand now. And finally, in 2014, I drank the Kool-Aid and I decided I was just going to travel the world. I had always dreamed of traveling the world. So I did what all logical millennials do. I booked a flight to Cambodia with a bunch of strangers and I started traveling. And I've never looked back. But I also started collecting that same year junior ranger badges in the national parks out of an homage to my mother. A friend of mine is a national park ranger at Lake Maine, and she introduced me to the Junior Ranger program. And as a full-grown adult, I started collecting the Junior Ranger badges. And so now I spend as much time as I can traveling from national park to state parks, collecting Junior Ranger badges at national historical sites, parks, and other places. I also have one from Canada.
The Junior Ranger badges, I'm just going to do an aside, nothing to do with what we're talking about today. My friend Mickey, who is in her 70s, has been trying to hit all the national parks in her lifetime. And she ran into this young boy who I believe was like 10 years old at the time with a backpack full of the patches. And so they struck up a conversation and then a friendship. To this day, they still write each other. That's how these bonds can form over these common interests. I just think it's so cool that the kid's now a teenager, writing to the 70-year-old lady, and they go back and forth, long, lovely letters. It's just so cool.
That's beautiful. Handwritten letters are amazing.
Today, we're going to be talking about Acadia National Park in Maine. What makes Acadia so special?
Acadia National Park, in my opinion of national parks, is one of those bucket list parks. You know, you've got Yellowstone, you've got Yosemite, you've got those iconic parks. And Acadia, to me, is the bucket list East Coast park. On top of it, as a traveler and somebody who loves being outside, and I can't say it's most beautiful because every one of the parks is just drop dead gorgeous in its own way, but Acadia has that ruggedness with the coastline, the rocks, and everything right against the brutal Atlantic water. And I just think it's one of the most magical places you can discover on the East Coast.
And so for those that may not be familiar with it, try to give us an overview of what that landscape does look like.
So 2 years ago, I started coming to Maine on again, off again. I had a couple of work gigs in Maine and things like that. And my first drive up there, you're driving through, and I was lucky. I drove through like quintessential New England right in the middle of peak fall foliage. So if you're going to do it, that's when you do it. And you get up to Maine and it's not like anywhere else on the East Coast. I grew up on the East Coast. I'm used to our beaches and our shores and things like that. But you get up to Maine and suddenly it becomes piney and rugged. I'm not going to say mean because I usually use that to describe like Tetons, but it gets harsher and more aggressive. And the land just looks like it was cut off into the ocean with these giant boulders and beautiful cliffs with these hardy pine trees just leaning out over the ocean. The skies are usually gray and they kind of beat against this land in this way that just suggests such perseverance.
And I think the landscape too, as I understand it, that's all that part of the ruggedness is caused because when the glaciers pulled back, it like ripped the land apart.
Exactly, yes. And Acadia does have some glacial formations.
Well, all right. So let's talk about the kinds of things that we'd see when we get there. I looked at, on my research, I saw two main categories. One was the Isle of Haute, and I'm probably saying that wrong. And the other was the Schoodic Peninsula.
So it's actually three major locations for the park. So there is the Isle of Haute, which you can only get to by ferry. There's the Schoodic Peninsula, and then there's the Mount Desert Island region. And so the whole thing is, and then there's also little islands off the coast. One of the most beautiful things about Maine is the thousands of little islands off of the coast that you can see from any peak when you hike in Maine along the coast and you're looking out. So you get there either you can drive in from either Bangor or Portland Airport. And you cross through and you get to the park. And what I love about it is you will see the small towns, the old school fishing villages and things like that. And then before you know it, you're into Acadia National Park. And one of my pro tips would be, and I'm a sucker for this at any national park, I hate sitting in traffic as much as the rest of the world does, but it's a scenic traffic loop for a reason. And so it's beautiful. And so if you can just do the scenic traffic loop, you'll see the coastline and the ruggedness and the rocks and the pine trees. And then you can go into some of the calmer forested areas and it gets thick. One thing that I think is very common to parks on the eastern side of the nation is that they're almost claustrophobic with how thick their trees can get, which is very different to me than when you're traveling to some of the bigger parks out west. But you get between these thick trees and the world can feel so small and so big all at the same time.
Oh, and also, if you didn't want to drive or if you're going by yourself and it's kind of hard to rubberneck the landscape, they do have in the summertime a free shuttle bus that does the loop. So that way you can be enjoying the scenery without having to worry about hitting other cars or bikes or something on the road.
And that would be lovely. I've not done that, but I like playing tourist, especially in my own backyard. So I would love to take the free bus loop. I also get really distracted when I'm driving. Yeah, it would be a much nicer way to do it.
Yeah, and from what I saw too, you can actually, if you want to not, because if you're staying in the park, you have to camp. I don't believe there's a lodge there, but you can stay in Bar Harbor and the free shuttle can take you right there to the park. So you can just either get transport into Bar Harbor and not even rent a car or leave your car there and not have to worry about, because I do understand it does get congested in the summertime. You were there in the fall when it's probably not as busy, but they get about 3.5 million visitors a year. So in the summer, it's going to be crowded.
It is a very crowded park at peak season. That is one thing I made sure to write down in my notes to tell your listeners is it gets really crowded. So when you do want to do some of the iconic hikes and things like that, finding parking can be really hard. So if you have the ferry or the shuttle bus that you can hop on, that's a great way to get to the locations. We stopped to check out Sand Beach and do some of the hikes from that point. There's a beautiful coastal walk that goes on and it's a lovely spot and it's really accessible, but parking, I think we parked at least 1.5 miles away just to get onto the beach. And we were there in Memorial Day weekend, which is quite early for Maine. It's still chilly and cold. I think a lot of people think Memorial Day weekend is the start of camping and grilling and everything, but Maine is still quite cold. And so it doesn't really peak until a little later in the season, but the campgrounds were already sold out. And the parking was already crazy congested. So having alternatives is very important.
And speaking of the camping too, I wanted to look and see what the accessibility is. There's like nothing available for the rest of the year. They open up reservations April 1st. So if you want to do this, April 1st, get up at like midnight and book your spot.
Exactly. Yes. So camping within the park can be really hard because I would say it is one of the more rugged parks to camp at because the weather can be so much harsher. I live in Maine currently, and I still have flannel bed sheets on my bed inside of my heated building. So think about that if you're planning a trip to camp in Acadia. Bring the right gear. But there's also some really cute campgrounds right outside of the entrance to Acadia National Park, not far from there. And I've stayed at those. I stayed at Hadley Point Campground last year, and they have a bunch of, it's definitely like group campsites. So you get like 75 other families. And I get that that's not backpacking for everybody. But if you're trying to get in and you can't make a reservation in Acadia National Park because you decided at the last minute you were going to go, it's a great alternative. So they have the trailer hookups. They actually have several small cabins as well. And they have traditional plot campground sites.
That's a great alternative. So let's get back to the landscape again, because that's what attracts people there. Can you tell us a little bit about Cadillac Mountain?
Yeah, so Cadillac Mountain, and this is like bucket list moment. If you're going to be in Acadia National Park, you need to have an early night in bed, and you need to get up incredibly early in the morning and get to the top of Cadillac Mountain, which is accessible by car. You can also hike it, and that's a dedicated hike in the morning, very, very early. But to watch sunrise at Cadillac Mountain is the iconic reason that Acadia, in my opinion, is so popular. You have this romantic dream of, 1960s and people driving up Cadillac Mountain and parking and watching the sunrise. It's absolutely beautiful. It's not an incredibly steep mountain, but it is the highest point on the Atlantic coast in the North America at 1,500 feet. And it is coined, the first sunrise in the United States.
And if we want to get up, we have to do time because the sunrise is going to be different times of the year. How much time should we allow to make sure we're up there plenty of time if we hike it?
This is a bad question for me because as a photographer, I always want to give myself a lot more time than needed. So I leave ridiculously early. And I was actually just chasing sunlight 2 days ago. And I noticed that I was peaking sunrise at 4 a.m., which could be painful for a lot of people. But I was starting to get that color in the sky at around 4 a.m. 2 days ago. And this is the middle of May. So you are going to want to get an app or be paying attention to actual sunrise time and knowing your own pace. There is I think with the car you can get is very close just to park and get up there, depending on your level of how much you want to get outside at 4 a.m. in the morning.
Right. You can always go back to bed. I mean, that's worth it. When my sister and I did Chiripo in Costa Rica, we got up at like 3 a.m. to hike to be up at the peak at sunrise. And that was just so worth it. You could just see it on our faces on the photo.
It's definitely like I've done sunrise in a lot of places around the world and you wake up and you're like, why am I doing this? And then it happens and you can't take that back. It's worth everything. And I'm horrible. I always say I'm going to go back to my cabin or my campground or my hotel, wherever it is I'm in the world, and then I'm going to take a nap. And I never do because I'm in this amazing place and I want to see it.
Another popular place is Thunderhole. What's that?
Yeah, so Thunderhole is this really cool little swell where the waves crash, and it's a really easy little spot. And I believe you can walk to it from that ocean cliff walk. I could be wrong. I need to check my hikes there. But you go down, and it's amazing because it's where especially on a rugged day, and that usually involves a little bit of rain and a rain jacket, so be prepared. But on a rugged day, the waves are just crashing there in this spot, and they can have the explosion of the waves like 40 to 60 feet high. It's absolutely magical. If you have little people, it can be a little intimidating. It looks scary. It also looks beautiful. So just keep in mind that whoever you're walking down with, it's A, going to be crowded, and B, it can look a little bit fierce.
It sounds like Acadia is just like really wild, like primal wild.
I feel like Acadia is this magic place on the East Coast. Often when I'm explaining the mountains to the people that haven't hiked as many places as I have, is I like to explain that like the Grand Tetons have a piece of my heart because it looks like Zeus got angry and struck the earth with lightning, and you got these 3 sister peaks that just were made from magic and anger and godly power. And then you get out to Alaska, and everywhere you look is just these amazing peaks that are ridiculous. And all through the West, you have the Rockies and their peaks, whereas you get to the East Coast and you get the rolling and the green of the Appalachians. And I think it just is more tame somehow. And then you get into Acadia and Cadillac Mountain and even the White Mountains out there, and things get a little more rugged. And I think often people underestimate how rugged these mountains can be. They're not tall, but they are quite old. The hikes can be very steep and very hard on your knees, and they can go straight up for a mile if you want them to. I would say that it is wild. And if you have the adventurous side of you and you can go in a less traveled season, do it. Because on the main hikes and things like that, it gets a little tamed by the fact that there are just so many people visiting the park. But it is a beautiful place.
So let's talk about the hiking. It looked to me like there's a variety of levels of difficulty from easy on to moderately hard because of the steepness.
Yes.
Any particular favorite trails?
I don't have any favorite trails yet because I haven't hiked enough of it. I only have favorite trails in Shenandoah, just because that one has a special place for me.
Well, I want to get you back on for Shenandoah as well then.
That's where I lost my heart, in Shenandoah. But I think that as far as hiking Acadia, what I like about it is it's accessible to whatever level you feel like hiking at that moment. So you can do the loop, and from there you can hop on the hike that's right for you. I think it's important to always know our own limitations when it comes to hiking. And another thing to keep in mind is at certain times of the year, they close off certain hikes for the wildlife and things like that in the region. But I like that there's a lot of short, quick, easy hikes for the quintessential viewpoints. And then I like that you can drive to the top of Cadillac Mountain, or you can start at the bottom and you can hike all the way up. Hiking up Cadillac Mountain is not for everybody.
But it sounds like fun. I think I would like to do that. And I noticed too, when I was at the National Park Service website yesterday, the peregrine falcons have come back after, let's see, I think the last they were seen was in 1955, and a few years ago they're back. And so now several of the trails are closed right now because it's nesting season. So they have multiple breeding pairs up there now. So that's kind of cool. And I imagine since they also have black bears, when the berries are ripe, that they might be closing off certain portions of the trails just to bear activity.
So I did not have any bear issues while I was in park. I have a joke that there's also no moose in Maine, which I know is totally fictitious, but I've seen moose in a bunch of other places in the world. And the moment you get into Maine, if you drive through Maine, you see signs for moose. And I've lived here for a while now, and I've yet to see a moose. I have a joke that it's just a marketing campaign. But moose and bear are on the island, though they're not terribly often seen. But what's cool about the peregrine falcon thing is I happened to be in there in the park season last year. The rangers shut down part of the trail, but they set up, and this is where it's important to see what's happening in Acadia at what time of year you go. They set up with these telescopes, and they come out during certain hours of the day, and they're there every day, and they're tracking their birds so they know where to look. But they have programs in which they'll come out and teach you about the peregrine falcons with the telescopes on them. And I was lucky enough to actually get to watch the birds flying in and out of their nests. And it was one of those really amazing moments. And you're also looking up on this cliff, which you can't possibly expect on the East Coast because it's a proper cliff and there's bird nests on it. And so it was really neat to have the birds back in the park and to have the ranger program out there actively educating people on it.
Very cool. And the rangers offer all sorts of tours, of guided tours. They're both on the boats and on the land side. So that's definitely you want to, and I'll put links to the Park Service for Acadia in the show notes and on the website for this episode, because they've got a really nice program there, like you said, and I didn't know about the telescopes. That's cool.
Yeah, and that's also back to my Junior Ranger program. It's part of the Junior Ranger program there as well. But they have also another event I want to do in Acadia that I haven't had a chance to do yet, is they do a night sky festival, and I believe it is in September. And if I were going to book a trip in September, if I wasn't already solidly booked, I would be there for the night sky festival, because one of the most magical things about Maine is not just how gorgeous the coastline is or the mountains are, is simply we don't have as many people in Maine. And so at night, I can look up from my place and see the Milky Way. And so when the skies are right, looking up outside at Maine, it's absolute magic. And so once again, set that alarm clock for about 2 a.m. and just get up and go outside. And it's best on a night that it's bitterly cold, because bitter cold means there's no cloud coverage keeping the warmth down. So dress in all the warm layers, no matter what time of the year you go, and step outside at night and just stare at the sky.
And also, too, we want to talk about the fact that there is biking there, too. But again, you're going to want to check with the Park Service website, because as the snow melts, that makes muddy tracks. So until the mud subsides a little bit, they don't let you put the horses and the bikes out. It'll only be foot traffic.
Yes, and Maine has a proper mud season. We're hoping that we're towards the end of it, though it's been a very, very wet year for New England. And so it's getting on trails has been really hard if you're respectful of the trails. And I love being an advocate for good trail, and so I don't want to do damage to them. It's been incredibly muddy this season, so you do want to pay attention to when you're going. And once again, this is better. There's a reason there's a peak season with Acadia. It is prime in the little bit later in the summer when it's drier and you can get the bikes out there. You can also go kayaking, which is lovely. And I believe that's also a ranger-led activity. I could be wrong, but I think they do guided kayak tours.
I believe you're right on that. I'll double check that and put in the show notes. If not, I'll also put a link to kayak guided tours, and also where you can rent kayaks if you don't want to bring one. And I just picked up yesterday, I bought an inflatable kayak. My sister has one and she loves it. I was like, oh, shoot, that sounds convenient. So that way I could just pop it in my trunk of my car.
Yeah, I mean, I've wanted, I have like really old school kayaks, so I'm itching to buy new ones, but I'm one of those people, I'm like, well, that still works. But they're older and they're heavy, and it's really hard to lug them around by myself.
So anyway, so I'll have to let people know how that works out for me. And also you can horseback ride. I assume you can bring your own horse, or there's probably horse rentals there for, a couple hours to half a day.
And there's a ton of carriage trails, which is perfect for your horseback riding, your more casual hike, biking, things like that. There's a ton of carriage trails in there. I want to do some more research. I was out hiking Western South Carolina 2 years ago, and I ran into a man who's as passionate about the national parks as I am. And he was telling me that, please, everybody fact check this statement. And you can email me and tell me if I'm wrong or not. But he was telling me he was kind of anti-national park and more the state parks, because he said Baxter got angry at Acadia and the fact that people were using more cars in a national park than they were getting out and actually hiking. So Baxter Park was founded, which is also in Maine, and you have to park and that's it. The only way in is on your feet with your rugged gear. And so I could imagine that the carriage trails and things like that were almost the antithesis of Baxter National Park, the idea of so many people just kind of getting up the mountain with things other than their own feet.
Baxter, that's where Katahdin is. And Katahdin, if you're not familiar, is the terminal point of the Appalachian Trail. Do you have any idea how far it is from Baxter to Acadia?
It's about 2 hours and 35 minutes from Acadia to Baxter.
So in Acadia, we can hike, we can bike, we can kayak, we can horseback ride, but also we've got all that beautiful water, and they have lots of boat tours and the little island out where you can camp as well if you're lucky enough to get a campsite or do a day trip. Can you talk about that?
So you can do all sorts of boat tours from Bar Harbor, or if you get on the ferry magically in Acadia National Park. It is the least trafficked part of the park, is that ferry ride to the Isle, because people just aren't doing it. It's not as accessible for the 3-day, backpack weekend or 3-day camping weekend. I also joke about the puffins, because expectation versus, reality. I think people expect to see whales and puffins and everything. And it's like, okay, nature has a place. It might not be exactly where you're looking for it. But if you can get on a boat tour, that's where you are going to be more likely once you get a little bit away from mainland and out. And it's not far. It's not far at all once you're on the boat, but you can actually start to see more seals and puffins and otters. And then you can even do whale watching tours from the water. I actually had a friend on the water a week ago, and he was like, oh, whale. So I was getting text messages, well, whale.
They also have bald eagles, I believe ospreys, cormorants, and I imagine that once you get away from all the people, that's where you're going to really see the wildlife and not so much around all the crowds.
Yeah, and another thing I've been noticing a lot more of as well is, and I'm about 2 hours south of Acadia, but coyotes. So you do need to be regular, basic, common sense when you're outside. It's not West Coast, there's no grizzly bears, but we are getting more coyote and things like that. And moose, just, common sense. These are still wild creatures, and moose are quite large. And so if you get the lucky joy of seeing one, you can also tell me, because it breaks my theory, but treat all the animals with respect. We had a video, and we can Google it, but somebody in the town of Rockland was attacked by an otter last year because they're not sweet creatures.
And they probably are invading the space, or it could be a mother. And when I was out I could see the Grand Tetons where we were camping. Elle came into the campground, right there. So we're stepping away. This idiot, it's right in front of this 2,000-pound beast that was not paying attention to it that much, but he was within 5 feet of it. If that thing decided, I don't want you there anymore, that guy would be killed. It was stupid.
There's a curse and a blessing to the national parks. As a photographer, I'm selfish, and I want that landscape to be my own so I can take that picture. But as somebody who also actively loves being outside and promotes being outside to other people, I try to remember my place in that. And so you do get people that don't have that wilderness common sense. And I have seen so many bad examples of people outside from disrespecting the trails. And that's just using the trails when you shouldn't be, whether you're horseback riding or mountain biking on wet trails. And each area has its own set of rules, but they're usually posted, or getting just way too close to an animal. At the end of the day, people, it's still a bear or an elk or a moose. And yeah, it's neat, but please put your iPad away.
Don't forget, you got a zoom feature on your camera.
Yeah. And another cool trick that a lot of people don't realize is if you have a good set of binoculars or a telescope on a tripod, if you're hunting, that photo of those animals, and I don't mean hunting as in the animal, but I mean if you're looking for that photo, you can actually take your cell phone, and put it up against the scope of a telescope or binoculars. And yeah, it's not the best photo in the world, But if you need to get the picture of that peregrine falcon on a cliff a quarter mile away, it's pretty handy.
Yeah, actually, the first time I saw that was in Costa Rica at Manuel Antonio National Park, where our guide actually had the scope. I was like, how cool is that? We are like really close up.
Yeah, I've done it all over. I mean, they're not Nat Geo level photographs, but when you're like, I happened to see this thing at this time and I had the forethought to actually use my camera through the telescope lens. It's a handy little trick that people don't think of.
Now, is there anything that surprised you about it or something that you wish you'd known before you went there for the first time?
So I'm the world's worst planner. I don't plan anything before I get there, other than knowing I needed a campsite for Acadia. Otherwise, I probably would have just rolled up and been a little bit out of luck because it was Memorial Day weekend when I went. And I didn't realize that people would be brave enough to come to Maine for Memorial Day weekend. I would say that the amount of people was quite staggering for the size of the park. It seemed like no matter what time of the day I was trying to get somewhere, I was still dealing with the congestion and the traffic. And so that was a little bit staggering. I mean, it is New England's national park, so you do want to be there, and I get why it's absolutely crowded. But once again, if you can weather it in a season where it may not be so trafficked, or maybe in the middle of the summer when things are warmer and people are busy Monday through Friday, I would say get there then for the best odds of lower traffic from humans.
And if you're into winter sports, you can do that there. I mean, there's snowshoeing and cross country and all that kind of stuff, and you'd be able to see the northern lights, I would imagine. Is that possible?
Once again, I'm further south, but not by much. We only had one aurora alert this year, which, of course, it was gray, so we didn't get to see it. But there's occasionally times when you can see the northern lights. And once again, if you're out there, I do think it's important to get out in the middle of the night and just see the sky. There's something so humbling about being under that many stars. And in the winter, to me, that's when the sky is best. It's so clear. And there's thousands of, I was actually driving to the airport a few days ago, and it was my closest airport several hours away. So I was leaving in the middle of the night, and I always pull over and just make sure to look up to see what the skies are like in Maine, because it is one of the gifts of being in Maine. It's just the beauty of less light pollution. The winter sports are absolutely rad. You've got snowshoeing and cross-country skiing and all of that. Once again, always be prepared. I think preparedness in sports, especially in winter sports, is incredibly important. Your gear is important. I have people that ask me like how I stay warm, and I'm like, I wear base layers every day. And so I do think having the appropriate gear for being outside in a place like Acadia in winter is important because the weather can be brutal.
Right. And I would also suggest not just in the winter, but anytime to carry an emergency pack. And on my sister podcast or companion podcast, I just started the Adventure Travel Show podcast. I just recently did an episode of what you should be carrying in your pack. I don't care if you're just going out for just a day hike. Things can go wrong, and you want to be prepared if all of a sudden you find out you have to spend the night. So anyway, I'll put reference to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And like I mentioned before, it's still cold here. So have a couple of sweaters or a couple of base layers just ready no matter what time of year you come.
The layers, it's all about the layers. And I can also put notes about that too. And I would say too, to me, if there's a chance that it's going to go below 40, not only do I have my puffy jacket, which I have in my pack almost all the time anyway, I'll also make sure I have my rain pants and my waterproof gloves, because if you get wet and it gets cold, you really get chilled.
Yeah, and it's very easy to get wet. I mean, if you're going down a Thunder Hole, or even if you're just walking along, the sand beach, it's easy to get wet. And like I said, we've had an incredibly rainy season this spring. I'm hoping that it starts to thaw out a little bit, but it's been raining like way too much. And so having the right rain gear, because you're on the coast, it's going to be windy, and that wind can just chill. So even on a good day, even if it's in the 60s and it's lightly raining, that wind chill is going to get you.
Right. And it might even act just like a windbreaker too. Now, do you get pop-up storms like we do down south?
No, I haven't experienced, well, I shouldn't say no, as a matter of factly like that. I have not experienced a pop-up storm. Every storm that we've had, we can watch the radar and see coming. But I have friends that are in the boating industry, so I might just have a little more intel on that, because they have to actively be watching the water to see what they're doing, whether it's lobstering or oystering or sailing.
Okay. Any other advice that you want to give people about Acadia?
I think Acadia is an incredibly important park to check off. I think it's just one of those beautiful places that you must see if you love trekking the national parks. And I think it's worth the experience of coming out. It's not easy to get to. It's not like you fly into an airport and in 15 minutes you're in a national park. You've got to plan a trip to Acadia. And once you're out there, it's like Bar Harbor or bust. You're not doing much more than actually being in the national park or maybe going to town. And so you have to respect that that's the adventure you have planned for the next few days. And I would hope that your audience is the right type of audience for that. But for some people, it can be a little bit isolating and there's nothing to do and everything closes super early at night. And it's like, yeah, you're in a state that's huge and its population's 1 million. Like, it's cool. And they're all in Portland. But I would definitely check out the rules for some of those coastal islands if you do it. Get the full experience. I'm not into lobster, but there's something to be said about, lobster on the coast of Maine and sitting there and just enjoying it. Like, I can totally be cheesy for that time period. And I think it's important to do just for being part of that experience of the place. Also, it's not just the coast. On Acadia, you want to check out the lake and the pond and things like that too.
Is there any place that we can go swimming?
Yeah, you don't want to swim. It's cold. Don't do it. Just don't do it.
So sand beach might be pretty, but not to go in.
You can go swimming. I mean, you can experience the water. There's freshwater and saltwater with the ponds and things like that. But I am from the South, people. I would encourage you not to attempt to go swimming. You're not going to go swimming. The water is way too cold off the coast of Maine to just don't do it. Do not do it. You are not prepared. You're going to dip your toes in. You're going to dip your toes in, and that's about it. I charmingly made the mistake a few years ago. I was racing for the Cabot Cheese, had a running team, and we did the TD Bank Beach to Beacon, which is actually in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, just outside of Portland. And it was in July, and it was a record. And this was my first trip to Maine, guys. Once again, I don't plan anything, and ignorance is bliss. That's just my caveat. But we finished this race. It's been incredibly hot. It's a team, and we want to celebrate. And so we do what every group of celebratory people do in no way whatsoever. We run straight into the ocean and we run straight out because it is so bitterly cold. Don't make that mistake. It's hurtful.
Now, I want to switch gears. I imagine when you're in camping, unless you're a glamour camper and brought a bunch of gourmet food, I'm not talking about the food at the camping, but in Bar Harbor, you're a foodie. Talk about the food there.
So I actually do bring a lot of food on my camping trips because I do love to cook over fire. So I'm not eating other than I stop at ice cream shops along the way because I think that's fun. So I cannot speak to the food in Bar Harbor. I can totally tell you guys how to cook like a chef over live fire. I'm sorry to not have a good answer
That's
there.
All right. That's okay.
We did, I brought a cast iron Dutch oven. It was hanging over a smoke pit and I did like a smoked pulled pork.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Tell us a little bit about, you do photography, you do some blogging. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about who Keita is and how we can reach out to you and follow what you're up to?
Yeah, so you can find me at passthesushi.com or girlcarnivore.com if you have a savory side. I am on Instagram as both of those, as well as on Facebook, Pass the Sushi or Girl Carnivore. I do teach photography from time to time on pop-up workshops, and you can find me on Twitter at Pass the Sushi. And traveling the country. I am on the road for like the next 6 months back to back, hanging out all over. So I'm going to be doing Instagram stories and taking my camera out a lot more often.
Cool. I'll make sure I put links to everything in the show notes and on the website. Be sure to go to the website to see some of the nice photos that Keita shared with us. And I'll try to put up some videos as well. Listen, Katie, is there anything I forgot to ask you that you wanted to make sure we knew about Acadia before we wrap up?
You know what? I think it's important to, on the loop, and it is a loop, but there's like one road that goes in between. There's a nature center, and it's small. It's not a huge nature center, but it's got a lot of really cool facts about the history in it and a traditional building out back from the indigenous tribe that was there. And so I think it's once again, I'm all for being a tourist when I'm in a place and learning about the place. And so I would say take the 45 minutes to an hour to kind of just check out the nature center and learn about the history of the park.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Keita. It's been great having you and learning more about Acadia National Park. I sure appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Acadia sounds super cool, and I can't wait to get there myself. And remember, if you are interested in going to Acadia, I do a free downloadable PDF on all places that we visit on the Active Travel Adventures podcast. So you can go to the website at activetravelaadventures.com/Acadia. Acadia is spelled ACADIA. And you can download the free travel planner. And of course, the monthly newsletter subscribers will get this automatically at the beginning of the following month. If you're enjoying this program, can I ask you a favor? Could you please go to whatever podcast app you listen to this on and write hopefully a 5-star review? It helps other people find the program. I'd appreciate it. Thanks so much. And I want to remind you also that we now have a companion podcast that comes out on alternate Thursdays called the Adventure Travel Show Podcast. And I encourage you to check it out and let me know what you think about it. So now you can have a little bit of adventure every week. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. It means so much to me to see that you guys are getting something out of this program. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully every week now. I hope to see you soon. Until then, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.